Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beckosphere, where we talk about climate news and solutions. If you would like to stay up to date with the latest international and US domestic climate news, I highly suggest you hit that subscribe button below and ring the bell so you don't miss every single time I post. You have entered the Climate Recap, where we talk about what is being done to reduce the impacts of and prepare for climate change. This time, we're going to cover the news for the second half of February, so February 15th to 28th. I'm going to start the video with all the news points that I want to go a little more in depth on, and then the second half of the video I'm going to list off all the other news stories that happened during that second half of February. Timestamps can be found in the description below. So let's go ahead and get started with examples of how climate is changing and impacting humans and the rest of the planet. Australia has declared the beloved koala an endangered species. The iconic marsupial population has suffered greatly from habitat loss, wildfires, disease, and years of drought. The environmental ministry warns that koalas could go extinct by 2050. Boy, what a time to be alive. The Australian government has allocated $35.7 million over the next 4 years to koala habitat conservation, which is good because a lot of the population drop can be attributed to deforestation and land clearing. But with the Great Barrier Reef restoration efforts, the government efforts negate climate change's impact on this issue. Climate change is exacerbating Australian bushfires and now is likely involved in the worst flooding in New South Wales and Queensland's history. Hundreds of humans have been rescued and thousands have evacuated. Koalas and other wildlife reportedly drowned. Over in Brazil, mudslides in Rio de Janeiro mid-February killed at least 117 people after the region experienced the heaviest rainfall since 1932. We're talking about 10.2 inches in a 24-hour period. And over in the US, during the last full week of February, the southern lobe of the polar vortex triggered another massive 50-degree temperature drop for the central US, bringing more snow, ice, and severe storms across the country. I can't imagine the weather dropping that drastically. The part of California that I'm in barely has a 50-degree temperature range yearly. Okay, now over to the studies. We have to talk about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's latest report. So the IPCC just dropped a report on the impacts, adaptation, and variability associated with climate change. This is the second in a 4-part series of how bad this shit frankly is. The first one came out about 4 to 6 months ago, and it talked about the physical side of climate change, like the physics and chemical side of things. Each part is compiled by a unique, independent, and international group of scientists. It takes about 7 years to create all 4 parts of this assessment. This part of the assessment reported that 3.5 billion people are highly vulnerable right now to climate impacts. That's almost half of the world population. Additionally, half of humanity is or will experience severe water shortages this year, and a third of us are or will be exposed to deadly heat stress, which is actually expected to rise to half to 3/4 of us by 2100. The number of people in flood risk areas increases by 500,000 every year, and diseases for humans, crops, and wildlife are spreading faster due to rising temperatures and higher humidity. If the temperature gets even a little bit above 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2100, and we're currently at 1.1 degrees above, 8% of today's farmland will become clinically unsuitable to grow crops around the time our population is expected to peak at 9.6 billion around 2064. We're currently at 7.8 billion right now, for context. 183 million are expected to go hungry from now until 2050 if no efforts are made to adapt. The report says that we need to conserve 30 to 50% of our planet to keep nature resilient enough to adapt. Today, less than 15% of the land, 21% of fresh water, and 8% of the oceans are protected. And as a result of human-caused climate change, chemical pollution, and habitat loss, among many other stressors, we as a species are bringing about the next mass extinction. If you want to learn more about that, Simon Clark just did a video talking about our concerning loss in biodiversity. This part of the report is the most depressing part of the overall report. It really lays out how dire our situation is, but the next section, which will probably be released in the next month, will cover ways we can cut emissions. Keep your chin up. We can still get out of this, but we have to take this very seriously for this next decade. If you want to hear other climate YouTubers' takes on the IPCC report, there is a whole playlist, which I will link down below. Fellow Americans, I am talking to you because the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, recently released a report showing that the US could see a century's worth of sea level rise in the next 30 years. That's about 10 to 12 inches on average. Now remember that sea level does not evenly rise everywhere. Texas and Louisiana should expect to see up to 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050. We have Rue to demonstrate. Rue, don't leave me. So here's 10 inches. Here's 12 inches, that's a foot. And here is what Texas and Louisiana can expect. Rue, could you please stand up for this? This is taller than my cat. They are expecting sea level rise taller than Rue in the next 30 years. That's terrifying. And the UN Environment Program released their own report around this same time that says wildfires that we've been enjoying more and more will become 30% more common by 2050, 14% more common by just 2030. The report advises governments to adopt a fire-ready formula that allocates 32% to prevention, 13% to preparedness, and 20% to recovery. Currently, responses are less than 1% going to planning and prevention, with almost all the fundings going towards direct response. Okay, now let's look at climate victories, starting with some very big international news. World leaders concluded the 5th UN Environmental Assembly, ending with a promise to broker a binding international treaty addressing the full life cycle of plastics, including production and design, by 2024. Finally, countries are talking about the plastic problem and talking about it from more than just a cleanup perspective. After all, a recent global survey found that 75% of people around the world want to end the use of single-use plastics. This promise to broker a binding treaty makes this conference, which took place in Kenya, the most significant international environmental negotiation since 2015, which was the Paris Climate Accord. During that same meeting, a Ukrainian official called on members of the assembly to entirely boycott Russian fossil fuels, stating, quote, "For decades, a lot of leaders have been using limitless and unstoppable fossil fuels. We've ignored the issue that it's influencing climate change. We've ignored that it's influencing our future, our global future." Moreover, this ignorance brought the rise of crazy dictators with a lot of money to kill people and destroy the environment. That was the Ukraine's deputy environment minister speaking from the environment ministry basement bomb shelter in Kyiv. Horrible. There were several scientists from the IPCC report who had to end the report contribution early because they were in Ukraine right as it was being bombed. Over in Australia, the country's largest coal-fired power station, Earring, has a new plan to close by 2025. 7 years earlier than the previous timeline. This is a reasonable timeline, unlike the coal-fired plants from Australia that we mentioned last time. Then to South America, Panama joined a growing list of mostly Latin American countries that have enacted laws giving rights to the natural world. The other countries so far have been Bolivia, New Zealand, Bangladesh, Ecuador, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. Obviously, some countries have taken this more seriously than others. Panama's law states that nature has a right to exist, persist, and regenerate its life cycle and conserve its biodiversity. It also has a right to be restored after being directly or indirectly impacted by human activity. This creates new obligations for Panama's government to make sure that all of its plans, policies, and programs respect nature, developing manufacturing processes and energy policies that safeguard ecosystems, and advocate for nature in its foreign policy. Beautiful. I hope to see more. And every time I say that, we see more. I'm liking this. Now let's talk about nuclear fusion, which originally seems like a science fiction idea for a long time, but now might actually have experienced a breakthrough. Nuclear fusion is basically all the perks of nuclear power that we think of it today without all the downsides. It's literally harnessing the power that makes stars shine bright enough for us to see them way out there in the galaxy, with fusing two or more atoms together, which releases a ton of energy as heat and very little waste. It requires just a bit of minerals that can be found in seawater. The European scientific consortium called Eurofusion, in partnership with the UK Atomic Energy Authority, hit a new record by creating 59 megajoules of power in 5 seconds using their donut-shaped nuclear fusion machine called a Tokamak. For contrast, it takes about 3.6 megajoules to power a home, so they made enough energy in 5 seconds to power 16 homes. Wow. Over in the US, students from Yale, Princeton, Stanford, MIT, and Vanderbilt have filed legal complaints with their respective state attorney generals, stating that the schools have violated nonprofit guidelines under the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, which requires universities to ensure that resources are put to socially beneficial ends. The students, with the guidance of the Climate Defense Project, are arguing that putting money towards fossil fuel companies is hurting society, not benefiting it. They're also arguing that investments in fossil fuels don't even make sense anymore, claiming that those investments have underperformed other investments over the last 10 years. The group estimates that these educational Ivy Leagues have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in fossil fuels. I'll keep you updated with how this whole thing goes. Similar legal actions have been placed against Harvard, Cornell, Johns Hopkins, Marquette, Boston College, University of Wisconsin, and the University of New Mexico. The Texas Supreme Court rejected appeals by ExxonMobil to claim California-based climate lawsuits against the company as California going against Texas sovereignty. They also were trying to claim right of freedom of speech, which I talked about a little bit last time. The 8 lawsuits filed by various climate cities and counties allege that Exxon lied to its customers about the product's impact on the environment. So it was good to see that their appeal was shut down by the Texas Supreme Court. And finally, the Biden administration held its biggest offshore wind sale ever, raising a record of $4.37 billion in bids. The wind farm will be located off the coast of New York and New Jersey. The top bidder was Bright Wind Holdings LLC, a joint venture between Germany's largest power producer, RWE, and Britain's National Grid. And Biden also halted new drilling on federal lands and waters indefinitely after his ruling to integrate the social cost of carbon into government decisions was blocked by 10 Republican states. Their reasoning that it would artificially increase the cost estimates of oil, gas, and drilling. Okay, so they're not even trying to hide their priorities anymore. So Biden halted construction of new projects and the permitting process of federal lands and waters to these companies. This is a very good move. This is the kind of stuff that we've been waiting for him to do for a while. And as it stands, I believe it's still in play, even though there's been a push to drop Russian oil, which puts more pressure on domestic supply. So let's hope that this halt stays there under pressure. Okay, now on to climate fails, starting with international news. According to a new study published in Nature Sustainability, the average carbon footprint of the top 1% emitters is 75 times higher than the bottom 50%. Moreover, if we were to eradicate poverty, it would raise emissions by less than 1%. Unsurprisingly, the Western world has a vastly greater footprint than everywhere else, especially the US, emphasizing the need for the US to make big strides now to drop our footprint and not make the excuse of waiting for other countries like China and India to go first. Now, of course, China is never helping its own situation because it just spent another $3.8 billion on another 3 coal mines. China saw its biggest increase in total energy consumption and coal use in a decade just this last year. China, this is really not the right direction. The International Energy Agency, or IEA, recently made a report which is called the 2022 Global Methane Tracker Report, and it is bad. It was the first report to lay out methane emissions of every country, and it found that the global energy sector has been producing 70% more methane than what is being officially recorded. Methane is a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, though it doesn't last in the atmosphere for as long. The energy sector accounts for 40% of man-made methane emissions. Many reasons why methane gets emitted, like leaky infrastructure, orphaned wells, and gas plants flaring, which is them burning their surplus of methane, are all considered low-hanging fruits for us curbing our carbon emissions. We could easily bring down methane emissions by 30% within this decade just by capping old wells and updating and checking up on infrastructure. The worst methane emitters are China, India, the US, Russia, and Brazil in that order. Over to Europe, Britain announced it will license new oil and gas activity in the North Sea despite energy experts saying that the new leases are incompatible with the UK's climate goals, and that medical leaders are calling on the UK ministers to end fossil fuel exploration for the sake of human health. They have ignored both of those groups of experts. European energy experts are also sounding the alarm for a mass greenwashing of blue hydrogen by the EU's green investments parameters now that gas is considered a clean transitional form of energy. Blue hydrogen is made as a byproduct of gas. But lately, fossil fuel companies have tried to develop new gas projects using the justification of producing hydrogen. As Mark Jacobson, the director of the Atmosphere Energy Program at Stanford University, describes it, quote, "Blue hydrogen is basically nothing but a smokescreen for more air pollution, mining, and fossil fuel use with hardly any CO2 benefit." If you would like to learn more about the difference between blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, I did a video a little while ago talking about hydrogen energy in general. The IEA recently reported that there are at least 50 blue hydrogen projects in the works right now. And this is exactly what the IPCC report was referring to when they said that governments have been spending money recklessly. So, not good. Over to the US, we look at another greenwashed form of energy, corn-based ethanol. Fossil fuel companies love to advertise ethanol as a renewable fuel that emits 20% fewer greenhouse gases than gasoline. But a new US-based study found that corn-based ethanol might produce 24% more greenhouse gases than gasoline. The research team specifically looked at the effects of the US Renewable Fuel Standard, or RFS, which requires blenders to add billions of gallons of renewable fuel to the country's transportation fuel supply every year, making the world's biggest biofuel program. The goal was to increase the US's fuel independence, but 15 years on, we're not independent, and the degradation of grasslands and forests into croplands, both domestically and internationally, to handle the biofuels' increased demand on corn is releasing carbon from the soil in the process. Corn production expanded nearly 7 million acres each year since the standard took effect, resulting in ethanol contributing 24% more greenhouse gases than just using gasoline. This isn't the first time that these researchers have done studies like this. They reported in a paper in 2008 that corn-based ethanol would double its greenhouse gas emissions over 30 years. The USDA and prominent agriculture-focused universities have countered these claims with their studies showing that corn-based ethanol reduces emissions as much as 40 to 45%. The U.S. Secretary of Agriculture recently reiterated the importance of lower carbon biofuels to the National Ethanol Conference. Now, I want to say that there are other types of biofuels made from everything from algae to food waste, and I do plan to make a video on that at some point. I think Just Have a Think has covered a couple of the different types of biofuel options, but ultimately some might help lower the footprint of industries that are hard to decarbonize, like aviation. But I think that this is a good cautionary tale to suggest that we should move away from fuel-based transportation methods to electrification. Back over to Texas. Last time we talked about the growing number of states that are following Texas's lead to blacklist companies that want to divest from fossil fuels. Basically, by blacklist, I mean that the state government would no longer support those companies. It's so dumb, because shouldn't they be divesting from fossil fuels, not divesting from companies divesting in fossil fuels? Unfortunately, these tactics seem to be working. After being threatened with being dropped from the Texas pension funds, BlackRock has backtracked its plans to decarbonize, going so far as to say in a memo that they want to see fossil fuel companies succeed and prosper. So, great. So much for letting the free market choose to decarbonize. Along these same lines, West Virginia just created a state-funded insurance company to help coal mine operators otherwise unable to get reclamation bonds, as many companies are recognizing coal as a dying industry. Reclamation bonds are basically collateral for coal companies, which they put up to ensure that they will restore and clean up land after they're done using it, which they are legally obligated to do. But often companies stop using the land because they file for bankruptcy, so the land never gets cleaned up, leaving private insurers and the state to clean up their mess. Because coal companies have become so unreliable, many bond companies don't want to work with them. Even if mining companies don't default, the bond money usually only pays for a fraction of the cost it would take to clean up the mess. So the companies usually choose to file for bankruptcy instead, so they completely get out of the responsibility. As a result, mining companies often get away with leaving an environmental mess for West Virginian taxpayers to pay for cleaning up. So all this being said, creating a new bonding program doesn't fix any of the underlying issues why bond companies don't want to work with them in the first place. Funny enough, the coal industry initially rejected the notion that a new bonding program was even needed, simply because they really didn't want to be singled out. It's kind of like when an office makes a rule, but everybody knows that it's because of this one employee. Finally, let's get into the fossil fuel fails. A new study shows that soot pollution in Antarctica is accelerating climate-driven melting in the most popularly traveled areas of Antarctica. The soot is mostly from the exhaust of cruise ships, vehicles, airplanes, and electrical generators as more people are touring Antarctica. It also comes from wind driven from other parts of the globe, but it's causing an extra inch of snowpack shrinkage in the most visited parts of the continent every year. Maybe there are just some places that we just shouldn't tour. And I say that I really do want to go to Antarctica, so maybe we just need to stop the tours until we're able to electrify everything. Okay, now let's get into the other climate news points I did not have the time to elaborate on. There is no favorite climate victory point today because I knew that I would be talking a decent amount about the IPCC report, and I don't want to make this video too long. I say as it's probably going to be 30 minutes long. There's a lot of news. All right, let's start with other climate changing examples. Snowpack in California is 73% below average already for this year. Hundreds of thousands were left without power after Storm Eunice slammed into the UK and Ireland. Only days later, Storm Franklin hit the UK, mainly Northern Ireland, with flooding and high winds. Meanwhile, Portugal's drought is getting worse. Syria's agricultural industry is being decimated by climate change-induced drought and a decade of war. Iraq's second largest lake, Razaza Lake, is drying up fast, and the Antarctic sea ice has fallen to its lowest level since measurements began in 1979. Now for some other new studies. Weather disasters affected 1 in 10 homes in the US last year. Plants are beginning to flourish in Antarctica as it warms. A new global data set was released talking about the projected impacts of climate change on corn, soybeans, rice, and wheat. Frankly, it emphasizes why we probably shouldn't rely on corn as a biofuel method. The drop in emissions from the COVID-19 shutdown in China has been linked to the record rainfalls in the summer that killed hundreds of people. Now, this is not necessarily an excuse for not dropping emissions, but it does really show how much emissions impact even just the local environment. New research shows that climate change is intensifying Earth's water cycle at twice the predicted rate, and a new study finds a link between extreme heat and increasing numbers of mental health ER visits. Now on to other climate victories, starting with Britain investing money into Nigeria's renewable energy and other adaptation and mitigation projects. The National Portrait Gallery has finally announced it's ending its BP sponsorship after 30 years. The journalism organization Associated Press, or AP, announced a sweeping climate journalism initiative. The banks UBS, Standard Chartered, and BNP Paribas have joined an initiative for building a voluntary carbon market platform called Carbon Place. Morocco just spent $1 billion to mitigate drought impacts. IBM announced that it will provide pro bono tech services and expertise to organizations serving communities vulnerable to climate change and other environmental hazards. India targets 5 megatons of green hydrogen, waiving renewable energy transmission charges for green hydrogen makers for the next 25 years. That's a pretty good deal. Minecraft is teaching kids about climate change. HSBC plans to cut emissions 34% by 2030 via its oil and gas clients. The future of highways might involve diapers. Mexico's top court canceled mining concessions near indigenous communities, and Paris is making a quiet zone free of cars in the city center. Now for some US-based climate victories. A former coal power site in Massachusetts will soon host an offshore wind cable plant. The American Cleaning Institute talked sustainability in its annual meeting. Honolulu, Hawaii secured a win against Chevron, Sunoco, ExxonMobil, and other oil and gas companies when the Hawaii Circuit Court judge rejected the company's attempts to dismiss a big climate change lawsuit by Honolulu. 2 new bills have been sent to Wyoming's government that would force all new coal-fired power plants to come with carbon capture and storage technology and infrastructure, and would encourage existing coal-fired plants to get them. The Department of Energy plans to offer $3 billion to boost domestic battery production and recycling. Biden voiced support for new mineral mines as long as they benefit the host communities and do not damage the environment. The Supreme Court smacked down the Dakota Access Pipeline repeal and stay down. That was my color guard stand chants coming out. The Biden administration also suspended the right of way for Alaska's mining road advanced by the Trump officials, and the EPA said that it will consider endangered species when approving new pesticides, which it's really annoying that they have waited this long to do that, but good that they're doing it. Now over to the It's Whatever section. We did have one, but I didn't feel like elaborating on any of them. Starting with Ethiopia starting electricity production at the Blue Nile mega dam. On the bright side, it's not fossil fuels. On the downside, it's a mega dam. Those really mess up the local environment and drowned vegetation emit greenhouse gases as they decompose. The White House rolled out a new climate justice screening tool, but it doesn't count for race, so that makes this announcement really nothing special. And the legendary climate activist organization 350.org is facing personnel problems and might not last too much longer. The group brought down the Keystone XL pipeline a few years back, so that's why I called them legendary. It sucks that this group is having problems and might shut down, but if they do, we appreciated your service. Now to the climate change fails, starting internationally. The Green Revolution rhetoric is undermining support for environmental action, according to a new research. The solution? Talk about nature. Oh my gosh. I have a bone to pick with this, okay? Because we started this whole climate activism thing talking about nature, talking about why people should just care because of the polar bears and because of the natural world. And that didn't work. So we're like, okay, sure, let's go ahead and talk about the economy because that seems to be something that people care about more. And now apparently rhetoric like the green revolution or the clean energy revolution, now it's turning people off. It's turning off about 30% of people. You can't win. It's so annoying. You can't win. I think there's just some people that don't want to hear about climate change, no matter which way you spread it. I mean, we can also talk about it from a public health perspective. And when they said also that they don't trust the term net zero, I kind of get that because net zero is a very vague term that a lot of companies are kind of greenwashing right now. But like, it's just so frustrating that now we're like, oh no, now that rhetoric isn't working. Anyways, I had to rant. Oh. Fossil fuel and agriculture handouts have climbed to $1.8 trillion a year. Electric car charging points are spread too unequally across the UK. Researchers say science is skewed by racism, and that is increasing the threat of global warming to people of color. Italy's push to create greener cities has led to $5 billion in fraud. The leading climate research publisher Elsevier, which owns Lancet and Global Environment Change, is also one of the top publishers for fossil fuel industries for the last 10 years. They publish books that help people learn how to drill for oil and gas better, like Shale Oil and Gas Handout, and strategies for optimizing petroleum exploration. They also give fossil fuel companies access to geofacets, which combines thousands of maps and studies to make it easier to find and access oil and gas reserves, in addition to locations for wind farms and carbon storage facilities. They've commissioned authors, editors, and journal advisory board members who are employees at top oil firms. Gross! What are they doing? Activists are raising inclusivity concerns for COP27 in November as Egypt hikes up hotel prices for it. It's normal for places to hike up prices for a big event, but in this case, we need everyone at the table, rich and poor, so that's a problem. The Canadian government has been funding a fossil fuel sympathizing researcher for years. The University of Victoria economics professor Garrett Cornelis Van Coten has held a prestigious title as Canadian Research Chair in Environmental Studies and Climate Change, while he is literally one of the 0.01% of researchers who doesn't even think climate change is happening. The South African province Limpopo is clearing way for a new China-backed $10 million coal complex. And the think tank behind the company Canon has been calling the climate crisis fake news and Greta Thunberg a communist. We'd love to see it. Now on to other US climate fails. Renewable energy is now the latest victim to misinformation. Texas has been updating its grid to improve its reliability, but none of it involves increasing renewables, despite the fact that increasing variability in the grid will help improve resiliency. Oil majors are shockingly not following through with their climate pledges. Bitcoin miners revived a dying coal mine. New York City's plan to get energy from a Canadian dam to make up for a nuclear power plant closure is now being fought by the same environmental activist groups that once supported the move. They have the same arguments that I made about the Blue Nile River Dam, but the Canadian dam probably won't emit as much because it's colder in Canada, so things don't rot as fast. So it might actually be a good clean energy source for New York City. I know that the whole hydropower thing is complicated. I only recently understood that a deeper and cooler lake made by dams emits less than a shallower and warmer lake, and that makes sense, but I just never thought of it. Still, though, it does disrupt the fish populations and could incite drought downstream. So, not saying dams are great, but some are better than others. And the US environmental enforcement activity has dropped since 2018, which is not a good sign. People should be arrested for doing bad things. Finally, to the rest of the fossil fuel fails. If you had lasted this long, by the way, thank you so much for your interest in these topics, and please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Okay, a New Hampshire town is seeing elevated cancer rates from high concentrations of forever chemicals found in plastics, or PFAS. New Hampshire recently reached a $25 million deal with Monsanto over a different chemical normally found in paints, coolants, sealants, and hydraulic fuels called PCBs. Even though PCBs were banned from use in 1979, they are still found messing up everywhere, from people to fish to birds. Monsanto allegedly knew about the harmful effects and longevity of the chemical, but didn't feel the need to share it with the rest of us. Internal documents showed that they knew compounds would lead to contamination of human food, particularly fish, the killing of some marine species like shrimp, and the possible extinction of several species of fish-eating birds. Wow, that is despicable. Continuing on this theme, researchers recently reported that they found widespread contamination of common grocery store items with the controversial weed-killing chemical glyphosate or Roundup. Wheat bread, chickpeas, and Quaker oats contained the highest levels of the pesticide, and most pesticide-laced foods were purchased from Walmart, Whole Foods, Hy-Vee, Target, and natural grocers. I don't know if they just didn't look at the other Trader Joe's and Safeway, but those were the ones that they mentioned. But this stuff is literally everywhere. It was even found in some organic foods. The US meat industry uses 235 million pounds of pesticides every year, threatening thousands of at-risk species in the process. And finally, for a bit of a turn away from those type of chemicals, but definitely into the fossil fuel fails for sure, air pollution may increase the risk of ADHD in kids. Whew, wasn't that a list? It just seems to be getting longer and longer. I've been trying to post on Mondays, but apparently this weekend I needed to sleep, so that's why I'm a little late on this. But next Monday I will be taking a look at California's climate action status, because I really need to know more about what my state's doing, and especially since it's kind of considered like the token Democrat solution for climate change sort of state. So I'll have a special guest too, so get stoked for that. Until next time, remember to talk about the climate crisis every single day and to support your local news stations. Thank you to the people on Patreon who help me pay for my equipment and the many news subscriptions that are needed to make these climate recaps possible. A special shout out to the climate confident and courageous David H., Norman Anal, Greg H., and Paul B. I greatly appreciate your support. If you would like to support the work I do monetarily, feel free to check out the Patreon link below or the Buy Me a Coffee link for a one-time donation. Thank you very much, and I will see y'all next time. Bye!